Welcome to the wonderful world of computer graphics. You know, this place is pretty great. These days we can make just about anything in here. Robots, aliens, big old worms, and of course, Henry Cavill's upper lip.
But I bet you didn't realize how much CGI was in this scene.
There you go. Oxygen, please.
This is a scene from the film Naiad, and it required just as much effort to create in the computer as any of the other examples, because all of the water you are seeing is fake. And I don't think people understand how crazy that actually is. And it's not just this film. Most Hollywood movies these days are filled with fake water that is basically invisible to the public because it's just that good.
As a VFX artist, I've always found water to be very intimidating. We've replicated so much of the intricacy of nature, but water is so complex, it's very difficult to recreate, which is why this water looks like crap. But what if I could make it not look like crap? What if I could create a river entirely in the computer that is 100% photoreal? Well, I'd have to figure out what tools were used on films like Naiad and Avatar: Way of Water to accomplish their incredible CG fluids. And what better way to do that than talk to somebody who knows the way of water better than anyone else? We are joined by WETA FX supervisor, Chris White.
How are you doing, Jordan?
I'm doing very good. Chris played a pivotal role in the development of WETA FX's new water pipeline for the Avatar sequels, but he also worked on Naiad. My first question when I did see the VFX breakdown of Naiad is, why? Why would you do this?
With Naiad, it was really important to the filmmakers that the current and the direction and the movement of the water helped tell the story. That she was being guided with the current and she was working with it or she was working against it. They weren't able to capture all of that within the tank, so we came in to help sell that story point. And it was important to not bring the viewer out of the picture. There's scenes that were extreme close-ups. We know that has to look great for it to be believable for the audience.
Do you feel that given where technology is, that I would be capable of creating something at home that is photorealistic when it comes to water?
The key to it is understanding the principles and the look of it. On Way of the Water, we spent years, we literally took a whiteboard, erased it, started with a single drop and said, okay, what's happening with water? And did a deep dive and studied all of those principles. We created our in-house system that we built, which is called Loki. It's our in-house system that we built.
Like in-house as in, we're not allowed?
It's our in-house system that we built.
It's not available for, like, me? Well, I guess that's it, huh? The tools I need are behind closed doors for the elites. I'm not elite. Can't even make water. Just a peasant begging for scraps from the king's table. In this case, the king's a really nice guy. Chris was lovely. Thank you, Chris. All I wanted to make is a fully simulated 100% photorealistic river, Dean. Is that too much to ask? But Chris did say something interesting. He said that the tools don't matter as much as understanding the principles of water. You know, Chris is right. If I can just learn all I can about creating simulated water, then I wouldn't need their fancy tools. Even a dirty peasant like me would be capable of creating CG water that holds up to the real thing. You know, diving into water simulation, there is so much info. It's hard to tell what's important and what's just, well, noise. You know, it seems these days we're all drowning in information. And that's where today's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. See, Ground News helps you navigate through the murky waters of today's media landscape. It's an amazing app and website that brings together news articles from around the world, letting you compare how different sources report on the same story. It's perfect for getting a well-rounded view of any news topic. Oh, what's that? You want to know how it works? I'll show you. Here's an example with the story, Records Tumble in Southwest US as temperatures soar well into the triple digits and 122 in Death Valley. That is almost as hot as it is in this freaking robe. I'm dying out here. Kind of like the world. That's right, pretty soon we're all gonna be in Waterworld, baby. And I honestly wouldn't mind it. Ground News shows me this story has been covered by over 29 sources. You can scroll down, see every article, their political bias, and the credibility of their reporting. For this story, 41% of the coverage leans left. 45% is center-leaning, which isn't really leaning, is it? And 14% is right-leaning. It's kind of cool to know that, I think. One useful feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. which is available with their Vantage plan. It highlights stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum. These are stories you could have missed in your media bubble. I mean, we're all in one. Time to pop it with Ground News. In this way, Ground News helps us get diverse perspectives of current events, understanding complex issues better, as well as easily identifying biases in reporting. So, if you want to break free from your echo chambers and get a more comprehensive view of the news, head over to groundnews.com/corridorcrew to get 40% off a Vantage subscription. A marine biologist saw a shark throw up. Water simulations. Sorry, let's get back to that.
So, I dove real deep into computer-generated water. And in its history, I believe, lie the tools to simulate my river. It all starts, obviously, with how real water flows. The study of fluid dynamics has actually been around for a few hundred years. Fluid dynamics allows us not only to understand the flow of liquids, but also the flow of gases, like how air bends around the wing of a plane. The laws that guide fluid dynamics are surprisingly straightforward. You can actually write the critical equations on the palm of your hand. Look at that. Huh? I don't know what it means, but it fits. And I got tiny hands. Now, it wasn't long after the invention of the computer that this math was brought into the digital realm. But while the laws are somewhat simple to outline, their actual application is incredibly complex to simulate, and then orders of magnitude harder to actually visualize. Because it would take another 30 years for computer graphics to bring the first genuine fluid simulation to film. Prior to this, the only way to visualize water in movies was, well, with water. Whether it was massive water tanks being dumped onto real sets, or smaller tanks of water used in conjunction with miniatures, there was only so much that could be achieved visually. And it really didn't help that water didn't exactly play nice with other methods of visual effects at the time, namely green screen. See, water is very difficult to capture on a green screen due to the fact that it both refracts and reflects the green of the screen. And it's not like you can manipulate real water with stop motion either, so if you couldn't get the water to do what you wanted on camera, well, tough luck, because you couldn't get it any other way. But by the 90s, computer graphics began to dip its little toe in the water simulation world. It started with characters that had the appearance of water, like the pseudopod from The Abyss or the T-1000 from Terminator 2, which we've made separate videos about. But this was essentially using sine waves to change the height of the points on the surface of the characters, giving the illusion of a liquidy organism. But what if you have a film that is a literal world of water? 1995's aptly named Waterworld was the first film to use actual oceanographic and atmospheric data to emulate the waves of the open ocean. This allowed the production to replace the horizon around their massive ship sets with photoreal CG water. I mean, look at this. This looks great. Looks like an ocean, moves like an ocean. I might as well just use this 30-year-old method to simulate my river, right? Well, similar to previous effects, it's simply a linear displacement of the ocean's surface.
Now, what the heck does that even mean? Well, if we look at this, we have a grid with a simple texture on top of it, a black to white map. And basically, what I want to tell the computer is, hey, any elements that are pure white, be the highest point, and anything that is pure black, be the lowest point. So, if we have an animated map, and that map moves like ocean waves, technically we should be able to use this same approach to create what looks like ocean waves. Ta-da! So, this is great. This gives the illusion of an ocean surface, but in reality, it's just a grid that's being displaced in the exact same way we saw previously. Now, what that means for us is, well, it's not real physics. We can't ever get any real waves, because at the end of the day, these are points that are being displaced up or down. And in that way, we'll never have a wave dynamically crash over its neighboring points. It's all just trickery at the end of the day.
A similar method to this was used to even greater effect in 1997's Titanic. Like Waterworld, it's a linear displacement of the ocean's surface. But there were a few physics-based simulations used in the CG of Titanic. And to create this river, we're gonna need those physics. When we see the propellers of the ship, you can see these tiny bubbles being churned up by this machine. There was actually a version of this effect achieved in camera with a miniature, but Cameron thought the bubbles created were too big. To achieve this massive sense of scale of the ship, they needed to be even tinier. So the VFX team used a particle simulation. You see, particles had existed since 1983, and these little guys could actually simulate gravity, as well as collisions with other objects.
Now, in the real world, bubbles are generated through this entirely complex physical reaction to the propellers and what the water's actually made of. We don't have to worry about any of that. What if we could just create particles on the edges of the blade and shoot them out into 3D space? Well, we get a really cool looking result. got lots of little buddies floating out into the ether. But these obviously are not bubbles, right? These are actually just tiny little points in 3D space that we are shooting out. Not a lot of math, but you do get a very cool result. So if we can simulate particles and we can affect the forces of how they move, then why not just use particles to simulate my river? But if we just pause this simulation, let's zoom in and take a little bit of a look around. Look, these particles are actually phasing through each other. In a particle simulation, particles don't interact with each other. They're like New Yorkers. Sorry, I didn't mean, sorry. But what do I mean by that? Well, I can actually show you with another simulation. Here we have a stream of particles that are being poured into a box. If you'll notice, when the spheres make contact with each other, well, they're not really making contact at all. They all just fall and collapse through each other, as if their neighbors don't even exist. Now, these particles can simulate very quickly when they're only concerned with themselves. Like New Yorkers. Sorry, still funnier in my head. I swear, I'll land it. But imagine how much more complex it gets when every single one of these particles needs to know where its 1,000+ neighbors are every single frame. That's a lot of additional math. And if you add 10 times the math to a calculation, guess what? It's going to take 10 times longer to calculate. And this is not a large number of particles, not even close. Imagine how many more you would need to simulate a body of water, let alone a full raging river. And then try doing that on a 90s PC, where the most realistic game you'd ever played was Doom. And even if you had the patience to simulate all of those interactions, particles really only work well for emulating some of the phenomena generated by water. Because particle simulations don't really scale that well. What we need is a better way to track the dynamics of a fluid system, namely the pressure, which is the areas of least resistance, and the velocity, which is the speed and direction of motion. Now, there is another framework of thinking about 3D space which is key to tracking these dynamics. Until now, we've been thinking in terms of individual points in space, you know, these little dudes. But what if instead we think about 3D space as a volume of 3D cubes? Essentially, these cubes are containers of data that can pass information between themselves. So, using those elegant fluid dynamic equations, we can define how pressure and velocity move data through space.
So, that's it. We're done here. Let's just use volumes to simulate this river. Well, not so fast, mate. You see, the issue with volumes is, ironically, its imperfect ability to track how much volume is in it. And what I mean by that is, in a volume simulation, you can't really get a splash of water separating from the larger body and then recombining with it, because it'll shrink away into nothingness before it lands.
And it's gone.
So, this was the dilemma in the late 90s. Volumes are great at solving velocity and pressure, but bad at retaining volume. And particles are great at retaining volume, but bad at solving for velocity and pressure. But in 1998, one film was bold enough to attempt to bridge this gap, to use the best of both methods. Something not even Titanic, the most expensive film ever made to that point, was bold enough to attempt. A groundbreaking classic that you all remember dearly. I'm talking, of course, about 1998's Ants.
You're not serious, are you?
Okay, maybe Ants isn't the most memorable movie.
I have a thing about drinking from the anus of another creature.
But it will forever be responsible for a truly landmark achievement. Whew! Look at that. Just bask in the glory. Now, by today's standards, maybe it doesn't look realistic, but heck, it's moving like water. The team had to hire a guy who had just finished his PhD to even figure out how to do this. Unlike Titanic and Waterworld, it's not just the surface. There is an undulating mass that literally flows through space. Nick Foster, who developed the simulation software, figured out how to take the benefits of volumes and the benefits of particles and combine them to create CG fluid. And over the next decade, films began to radically advance both the speed and the level of complexity of these fluid simulations. There was 2000's The Perfect Storm, in which Industrial Light and Magic physically simulated these enormous waves, on top of which were separate particle simulations to replicate the foam and spray that would be generated by the boat slamming into them. 2004's The Day After Tomorrow, with an incredible flooding sequence where a giant swell overtakes New York. The film was able to add precise guidance to the fluid simulation, like suction pumps and whirlpools to control the flow of the water. And speaking of whirlpools, who could forget 2007's Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End?
Maelstrom!
Look at that whirling dervish of CG beauty. And of course, Avatar in 2009, which by many could be deemed as the start of the modern era of water simulation. CG water was at the point where it could be precisely directed to do the things that we could never capture on camera, but still based in physics. So, we did it! After decades of trial and error, this elegant math of fluid dynamics can now be properly visualized by computer graphics. Now it's time to see if I can replicate this magic on my own computer. And what better tool to use when trying to make some magic than Houdini?
So, since I've now learned the ins and outs of fluid simulations, I've built my very own from the ground up. Now, before I can simulate anything, I have to give my river something to run through. And so I found a photo scan online of a bone-dry ravine. I added a whole bunch of photo scans of giant rocks and boulders so that those liquids had something more dynamic to interact with. So the reality is, once I have my source of water and my collision geometry, I don't really need to worry about too much more because, like we've talked about to this point, the math has been done, right? People much smarter than me have crunched the numbers and devised systems to calculate all of that math on my behalf. So all I need to do now is let physics do its thing. Here it is. It's not bad. Like, it moves like water. You get the sense that it is rushing and gushing, you know? How the water is literally getting trapped and churning and spinning before rolling back out. But a lot of the detail is missing in those areas for some reason. I mean, this is nothing compared to the insane photorealism you're seeing in movies nowadays. So I'm gonna go check back in with Chris to see how I can take this render into the realm of the photo real. So Chris, you were a VFX supervisor on the original Avatar, and you were also a VFX supervisor on Way of Water. What are the major, like, significant differences from 13 years ago with Avatar to now in terms of what we can do with water?
It's still the same mathematical approach, but now we created this setup called the state machine, which does the main simulation, but it entrains the air as well. It creates the underwater bubbles that will travel up, and those become the foam, and then becomes the mist. So it's all this integrated system, so it all works together.
It sounds like you've built this state machine to press simulate, and then you have a result.
Although the machine lets you do it, the artist has control of the inputs, because after it comes out of the machine, there's a lot that goes into sculpting the surfacing of the water and making sure the parameters are appropriate to get the maximum detail. You know, do I want to make it choppier so that I get more white water? Do I want to have, you know, more foam or less foam? So the effects artist is making a lot of decisions to get the result that they want.
Is it possible to perfectly simulate the physics of water?
I think we can simulate visually very realistic water. I think that gets into deeper philosophical, like how, there's always some level of detail that you're simulating to. You're not going down to the molecules or anything like that. So you do have to cheat it. Because as you get into it, you're like, okay, yeah, we've got it down to this little level. And you're like, but if you really dig into it more, there may be silt that's being kicked up. There's all these complex systems. I mean, we're still, at the end of the day, we're still making movies, and it's about telling the story. That was part of the drive, was like, if we can give the artist a good system that looks good from the beginning, then they can spend more time being artistic.
That's actually really interesting that you say that. It's almost like, even if we do reach a point where on a molecular level we can perfectly recreate water, you would almost still need the artist in order to draw it in such a way that it tells the story that needs to be told.
Exactly. It always comes down to that. And the tools are there to help it look realistic and to help give us control, but all the discussions and decisions are made to that one point, like, what is the story being told in this shot, and how do the effects support and help tell that story?
I think I've had it backwards. I've been looking at it as, you know, more on the tools than the artist, but it seems like the tools are there to service the vision of the artist versus the artist to drive the tool.
Yeah, it's that support, yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us and lending us a little bit of your expertise.
It's great just talking about all this stuff and kind of digging into it.
You know, after talking to Chris, I started to realize that in order to take this render across the finish line, I need to start using my eye as an artist more. So naturally, I looked at real rivers, right, reference, and I started to notice the differences between my render and the stuff that I was seeing from actual footage. Real rivers, the water actually makes the dirt that it goes over wet. In real rivers, you're getting a much greater breakup of the overall light on the surface. It's not so globular and perfect like it is in this render. You're getting volumetrics from inside the body of the river itself as it moves over dirt and churns it up into like a thick, inky paste. And of course, we're missing a crucial aspect of this: cavitation, right? The foam, the bubbles beneath the surface, the spray. There's nothing here. It's just perfect glassy texture. And for all of these problems, I can't just click a button and solve them. I'm going to have to use my own intuition as an artist until I'm happy with the final image. Well, I made those manual tweaks, and this is the result. I'm very proud looking at this final image. I achieved what I set out to do. I created photorealistic water, and that's awesome. But what I've taken away is how much the hand of the artist still drives this process. Math and science without that spark of humanity is soulless. So knowing just how much of what we see on the big screen is thoughtfully crafted just makes it that much more beautiful.